So that's the nearest I get about trying to impart any wisdom. But I must admit, when I walk in the room, it's always one-on-one with one of the students. I walk in the room, I say, let me tell you first, I don't know how to do this.
He would never know just how strong his own scent really was. That was the surprising revelation from Paul McCartney in an interview with BBC Radio's program Legends Unfiltered. It wasn't about hit songs or iconic recording sessions, but rather about odors, the natural scents that Paul had to endure throughout thousands of performances with his legendary bandmates. Even though on stage they shone in glamorous outfits, smooth hair, and dazzling lights, right after the performances, their natural body scents often caused people to take a step back. From perspiration that hadn't yet dried to outfits that weren't changed frequently, everything combined to reveal a reality very different from the perfect image seen under the spotlight. So who were these legends? Keep watching until the end of the video, because the last person on this list made Paul exclaim, "That scent was really something, oh my." Number 1. Elvis Presley. His perspiration had such a strong presence that you could tell he was in the room the moment you stepped inside. There are stories in the music world that everyone has heard in passing, but very few dare to recount honestly. In a behind-the-scenes interview with BBC radio reporter Janet Morgan in late 2008, Paul McCartney once shared a memory he said he could never forget. This story had nothing to do with melodies, performance techniques, or production secrets. It revolved around something seemingly minor yet strong enough to overwhelm anyone who walked into that room: the natural scent around Elvis Presley. According to Paul, on the evening of August 27, 1965, when he, John, George, and Ringo visited the Bel Air mansion to meet Elvis, a meeting heralded as a historic encounter by Melody Maker, NME, and even Time magazine, none of them imagined that what would stay with them the most was not the music, but the atmosphere inside the room. Elvis was rehearsing for a new film project with MGM. He had just finished a series of intense moves that left him sweating non-stop. But what made things more surprising was that the rehearsal room was completely closed, with only one struggling air conditioner and harsh studio lights shining directly on him. When Paul pushed open the door, the first thing that hit him was not music, but a dense, warm, pungent scent, like damp clothes sealed in a box for too long. Paul once described it as, "Just cracking open the door was enough to know Elvis was already inside." He froze for a few seconds, then forced himself to step in. After all, it was Elvis, who could refuse? But each step closer meant another layer of scent rising around him, prompting Paul to stand near the window to catch his breath. John Lennon, according to several reporters stationed outside the mansion that night, including Carl Thompson of the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, also seemed a bit uneasy. George Harrison was said to have repeatedly adjusted the thin mask he often wore while moving around Hollywood, though no one knew whether it was due to dust or something a bit more delicate. While the Beatles tried to remain composed, Elvis appeared completely unfazed. He wasn't bothered by perspiration, didn't change outfits, and even continued rehearsing a few moves, making the room hotter still. A backstage employee at RCA, in an internal memo leaked in 1987 and later mentioned by magazines like Rolling Stone, once wrote that the outfits Elvis wore during rehearsals had to be replaced frequently because the scent lingered strongly. And that wasn't all. In early 1965, the teen magazine Tiger Beat unexpectedly published an article titled "Elvis and His Mysterious Late-Night Training Habits." The article described how RCA's gym room often held a very strong presence in the air after Elvis's rehearsals. The article survived for only 2 days before being taken down. Within Los Angeles media circles, rumors spread that Elvis's management requested its removal to avoid misunderstandings. But as things in Hollywood often go, the more something is erased, the more people talk. Many inside MGM recalled that between 1964 and 1966, the wardrobe department had to send urgent notes to management because Elvis's outfits after each scene held onto their scent for a long time, even after treatment. These notes were never officially released, but they lingered as quiet studio gossip for years. What made the story unforgettable, according to Paul, wasn't that he wanted to criticize anyone. It was because the moment reminded him that behind the glamorous spotlights, music legends were still just human, everyday, imperfect, and real. But at the same time, the story opened a long list of famous names who had sparked similar behind-the-scenes conversations. Paul did not recount these things with judgment, but as someone noting down what he genuinely witnessed. Right after telling the story about Elvis, Paul began mentioning a powerful Welsh vocalist, known for electrifying performances, but also for backstage situations that left entire crews quietly stepping aside whenever he entered the room. 2. Bob Dylan. Standing near him, you could immediately sense the sharp smell of burnt tobacco lingering in the air. Paul McCartney once joked in a private taping of the BBC4 program later that night that there were moments in an artist's life he remembered not because of music, but because of scents. And among the many unusual situations he witnessed in the 1960s, the one involving Bob Dylan was something that left Paul both puzzled and slightly uncomfortable, so much so that every time he recalled it, he couldn't help but laugh in disbelief. On the night of August 28, 1964, at the Delmonico Hotel in New York, the Beatles had just stepped off the elevator on the 6th floor when Paul felt the air in the hallway grow heavy. At first, he thought the hotel might have had a small fire somewhere because a burnt smoke smell mixed with old fabric brushed against him distinctly. But when the door of room 603 opened and Bob Dylan appeared, Paul immediately realized where the scent originated, from the very person they were about to meet. That day, Dylan was wearing his usual dark brown coat, the same one that reporter Larry Kane said he saw Dylan carry throughout the entire tour, from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The issue was that the coat looked like it had gone through many long nights, absorbing old perspiration, deeply embedded smoke, and a lingering dampness no one could quite identify, whether from rain, the stage, or Dylan's famously chaotic lifestyle at the time. The moment Dylan stepped forward to greet everyone, Paul nearly stepped back because the scent hit him so strongly. It wasn't the pleasant, woody kind of smoke, but a thick, sharp combination intertwined with fabric that hadn't been aired out. In a 1986 interview with The Observer, Paul described it as, "It felt like standing beside a coat that had a history of its own, a very long one." According to a work diary revealed by journalist Larry Kane in 1971, the Beatles quietly joked among themselves that Dylan didn't seem to believe in the concept of changing jackets. While late August New York was scorching, Dylan kept the same heavy outfit on all evening. He embraced a carefree image, disheveled, loose, unpolished, and once even told WNYC that he didn't want to dress neatly because it didn't feel like himself. This carefree lifestyle unintentionally fueled countless backstage anecdotes. A staff member at CBS Studio on West 57th Street shared on the show Inside Tracks that whenever Dylan left the recording room, they had to open the windows for nearly 20 minutes to let the air clear. According to this person, the lingering scent was a mixture of unfinished cigarettes, the sweat of long deadline nights, and old fabric that Dylan seemed to favor wearing for entire weeks. Dylan often showed up to social gatherings in this same condition. Rolling Stone wrote in 1978 that during his transition from folk to rock, Dylan almost lost control of his daily habits, eating irregularly, sleeping at odd hours, forgetting to change clothes, sometimes going entire days fueled only by coffee and cigarettes, to the point that even his hair held the smell of smoke. Paul said that when Dylan sat down on the Delmonico sofa that night, the faint smoke rising from his hair and coat created a thin haze in the room. Despite the spaciousness, it felt tight and airless, enough that Paul had to turn his head the other way to breathe. John Lennon tried to stay upbeat by asking about new music, though his eyes blinked repeatedly from the discomfort. After the meeting, George Harrison noted on a small paper, later auctioned in Beverly Hills, that Dylan was interesting to talk to, but the coat scent was challenging. A small scandal even arose around that very coat. In late 1965, an anonymous article appeared in the Village Voice, implying that Dylan didn't bathe often and repeated outfits for long periods. The piece sparked debate in New York's underground art scene. Dylan never responded, unintentionally fueling the rumor. Howard Malone of the New York Herald Tribune even wrote a short commentary analyzing Dylan's signature rugged aura, treating the scent as part of his artistic persona. Paul never held resentment toward Dylan. He continued to admire him as one of the musicians who reshaped modern music. But the truth was that standing next to Dylan that night left Paul in a difficult position, and the sharp smell of burnt tobacco mixed with the old coat remained in his memory for many years. Still, Dylan wasn't the last artist to leave Paul bewildered due to backstage scents. Because, as Paul hinted in a behind-the-scenes interview in 2009, there was yet another legend, famous for a thunderous voice on stage, but equally famous for a post-performance aroma that made entire crews quietly shift away whenever he entered the resting area. 3. Mick Jagger. I used to call him the Rolling Stones' walking sweat bomb. In the late 1960s, behind the scenes of music programs in the UK were filled with stories that only industry insiders truly understood, the chaos hidden beneath the glamorous surface. Paul McCartney once joked in an interview with BBC Radio 1 host Terry Ellis that sometimes what I remember most about an artist isn't the voice, but how dense the air became when that person walked past. And strangely enough, one of the people who left the strongest impression in Paul's memory was a colleague he genuinely liked, Mick Jagger. In early 1968, as bands took turns filming for Top of the Pops at Lime Grove Studios in London, the crew began whispering a half-joke, half-truth among themselves. If Mick runs by, the breeze will warn you first. At first, Paul thought it was just typical backstage humor from the camera team, but only a few hours later, he admitted that the saying wasn't wrong at all. Inside Lime Grove, the heat was already intense due to dozens of halogen lights surrounding the stage, raising the room's temperature by at least 5 to 7 degrees above the outside. Mick chose to perform with full intensity, sprinting from left to right, spinning, bending all the way down, and springing back up. That pace made his sweat flow uncontrollably. According to Tony Richmond, the lead cameraman of that period, long streaks of moisture appeared on the wooden floor like wheel marks after just 2 songs. Paul witnessed this even more clearly later that year, when he worked with the Rolling Stones during preparations for Rock and Roll Circus in December 1968 at Twickenham Studios. The studio lights were kept on continuously to maintain stable brightness for the circular stage. Technicians recalled on ITV's Rewinding the Circus that the set grew so hot that vapor rose visibly from the cement floor. Mick arrived wearing a tight, sequin-covered outfit, a material that trapped heat strongly. As he began running laps around the stage, the rising heat from his sweat felt like trapped warmth being released all at once. Paul was standing near the stage transition point, making him the first to receive that wave of heat. He later said the sensation was like walking into a gym after peak hours, when everything is soaked in human warmth. There was a moment Paul never forgot. Within just a few seconds of Mick running from the left wing to the right, the intensity of his sweat in the air was so strong that Paul had to step back slightly just to stabilize his breathing. No one on the crew was surprised. They were used to seeing technicians chase after Mick with giant absorbent cloths to wipe the floor. But for Paul, who was merely standing still instead of exerting himself, the experience was genuinely uncomfortable, and it didn't end there. After filming Wrapped that day, the Rolling Stones went into dressing room number 4 to change. But instead of switching outfits like most performers, Mick kept the same sweat-soaked costume, explaining that he didn't want to break the energy flow. This habit led to jokes circulating in television circles that Mick's natural scent intensified over the duration of his performance. In the January 1969 issue, Melody Maker published a short note mentioning the crew had to clean the stage repeatedly because of Jagger's intense movement, although they avoided mentioning anything about odor. Industry workers, however, spoke more openly. Sound technician Roy Hunt shared on Granada Television's Behind the Mix that sometimes just opening the door to a room Mick had recently left was enough for the entire hallway to guess who had been inside. There was even a small internal Rolling Stones story that Paul heard from a crew member. During the 1967 tour, someone once joked that Mick's shirts must be washed with industrial-strength chemicals, causing half the crew to laugh while the other half stayed awkwardly quiet. Rumors spread to the point that a piece in the Evening Standard hinted that Mick was too focused on performing, too little time for the washroom. The band quickly objected, but the story still became a talking point for weeks. Paul always insisted he respected Mick, but the natural scent Mick carried during high-intensity performances was genuinely a challenge. Paul once said something along the lines of, "Mick can sing, dance, electrify an entire audience, but standing next to him during rehearsal is a completely different experience." There was no mockery, just the honest recollection of an artist who had been caught off guard by such a memorable moment. And just when Paul thought nothing else could surprise him in the realm of backstage aromas, a famous female vocalist entered the list, bringing with her a very different kind of intensity, not from physical exertion, but from the extreme styling traditions of Motown, which had makeup teams sighing whenever she entered the room. 4. Diana Ross. The thick scent of her heavy hairspray mixing with the backstage Motown heat sent chills down my spine. There are backstage stories that make people instantly understand how stage glamour sometimes comes at the cost of very real trade-offs. Paul McCartney once said he had witnessed many unforgettable moments in his career, but one day in 1973, when he visited Hitsville, USA in Detroit to watch Diana Ross rehearse, every sense on his face nearly froze for a few seconds. What stunned Paul wasn't the music or choreography, but a scent so dense, a mix of hairspray and warm human heat, that it felt almost visible. That day, Motown Studio A was only a few dozen square meters, originally meant for live band recordings. The ceiling was low, and technicians had sealed all windows to prevent bass frequencies from leaking onto West Grand Boulevard. Paul stepped inside with Berry Gordy just as the dancers were warming up. Heat from dozens of stage test lights turned the room into a giant furnace. Everyone present began sweating within minutes. Then Diana appeared. Her signature voluminous hair nearly brushed the overhead lights, held firmly in place by a type of hairspray that, according to former Motown stylist Lorraine Parker, could stay fixed for half a day with a single spray. On the show Soul Time Revisited, 1985, Parker described the spray as so dense you could probably use it to glue wallpaper. As Diana walked past Paul, the hairspray scent fused with the trapped heat of the room, rising into a heavy mist that made him instinctively blink several times. By the first song, the thick fabric of Diana's outfit had already darkened in patches. Each time she turned or lifted her arms, the air in front of Paul felt like a wave of humid density. Heat radiated from her hair, her dress, and the powerful hairspray rising under intense lights. Paul was leaning down to look at a score Berry Gordy handed him when he suddenly felt as though someone had pressed a hot, chemical-scented cloth against his face. He looked up, just as Diana stepped right past him. In a later interview with Melody Maker, Paul merely described the air that day as quite heavy. But Motown backstage staff recalled the moment in far greater detail. A drum technician named Marvin Pockets Lee said in the documentary Remembering Hitsville that whenever Diana wore her signature voluminous hair, the makeup room had to bring in industrial fans just to prevent the person standing next to her from feeling overwhelmed. There were even rumors inside Motown that singer Mary Wilson once joked that walking behind Diana felt like moving through a cloud of chemicals. The story became even more sensational when the Detroit Free Press published a small piece in late 1972 mentioning an incident where a makeup artist had to leave the room due to discomfort from the heavy spray. Motown immediately denied the claim, but the rumor still spread quietly through Detroit's entertainment circles, giving Diana a backstage reputation as the star who shone brightly with a very distinct aura. Paul didn't witness those earlier incidents, but the 1973 rehearsal alone was enough for him to understand why people spoke of Diana with a mix of respect and caution. After her third song, the heated hairspray rising from her hair blended with the warmth from her stage costume, forming a scent difficult to describe. Not foul, not rotten, just thick, heavy, and suffocating, as though the air itself was wrapped in a chemical film. Berry Gordy, standing beside Paul, forced a polite smile and subtly turned his body away each time Diana tilted her head. Paul, ever the gentleman, stayed silent, but inwardly, he was wishing a door would open somewhere to let in a bit of cool air. Diana always appeared radiant on stage, flawless, dazzling, more striking than anyone around her. But behind those lights existed a reality rarely mentioned. Motown's commitment to perfection sometimes came with scent so intense that people nearby had to take shallow breaths and subtly step aside. Paul thought that after Diana Ross, no backstage aroma could challenge him again. But not long after, he met a vocalist once considered the soul of the rebellious rock movement, someone whose signature presence was so recognizable that sound engineers joked, "You could tell he was in the room before he even walked in." 5. Cher. The scent rising from the outfit was stronger than anything from her body, like damp fabric mixed with accumulated sweat. During the golden era of American television in the early 1970s, Cher had nearly become the standard of boldness. Each time she appeared at CBS Television City in Los Angeles, the entire studio buzzed. No one knew what she would wear next. Sheer lace, metallic armor, or body-hugging dresses made of chrome-like panels that reflected stage lights like mirrors. These outfits were so striking that magazines like TV Guide and Variety once wrote that Cher doesn't need to move, standing still is enough to own the entire stage. But behind all that glamour existed a backstage tale whispered only among production staff, and Paul McCartney accidentally became a witness. In March 1972, before Wings began their first U.S. tour, Paul was invited to visit the set of the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour. CBS was at the height of the variety show boom, so backstage was always hectic. Yet, the moment Paul stepped into Studio 43, the first thing he sensed wasn't the chatter or the drums, but a warm, heavy wave of air, as though dozens of heaters were running at once. Cher appeared at that exact moment. She descended the staircase wearing a tightly fitted dress made from hundreds of tiny metal pieces reflecting the lights in sharp flashes. The sight left everyone dazzled, but Paul, standing just a few steps away, was hit by something unexpected. A trapped, stuffy odor escaping from the inner lining of the outfit. The heat sealed inside the heavy costume changed the air around Cher immediately. The wave that rose from her smelled like fabric that had been sealed with moisture for hours, mixed with the compressed warmth of a body wrapped tightly in metal. Paul later told journalist Michael Parkinson that the sensation felt like standing right next to a row of stage lights. Even being polite, he still had to take half a step back to breathe comfortably. Paul wasn't the only one who encountered this. In Studio Memories, 70s television, multiple CBS wardrobe crew members recalled that Cher's outfits often caused a stuffy room effect, especially during long filming sessions. One anonymous stylist said that there was a time they had to use a high-powered dryer to ventilate the inside of one of Cher's dresses because moisture had built up so quickly. A sound technician once shared that if Cher stopped in the middle of the stage for a few minutes, the air around that spot would noticeably warm up. Even more interesting was a minor controversy in 1971. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner published an interview with a former makeup artist who hinted that Cher's tight metal outfits not only made the skin struggle to breathe, but also left a distinctive damp smell in the dressing room. The show's team strongly objected, claiming the story had been exaggerated. Yet the rumor still spread quietly through television circles, a small secret everyone knew, but no one said out loud. Paul knew none of those rumors that day. He simply witnessed Cher stepping off stage during a break, and with each step she took, a wave of warm air like the heat from a boiler mixed with metallic fabric scent drifted past him. Cher remained dazzling, smiling, radiant as always. But Paul could only inhale lightly through his mouth to lessen the stifling sensation. To him, the scent wasn't unpleasant in a negative way. It was the smell of exhaustion trapped behind multiple layers of non-breathable costume. A difficult-to-describe aroma, invisible to the eye yet unmistakable to anyone standing near her. Cher's moment made Paul feel like he had experienced every stage scent possible, but the list unexpectedly expanded in the most unpredictable direction. 6. Aretha Franklin. When she walked past, the smell of sweat was incredibly strong, not pleasant but sharp and intense. There was a rumor in the soul music world that Paul McCartney once heard from musicians at Stax, and he always assumed it was just a playful exaggeration. People would say, "Aretha Franklin doesn't sing with her throat. Aretha sings with her entire body." It sounded poetic, but when Paul personally witnessed a very real moment from Aretha in 1973, he finally understood that the meaning behind the phrase was stronger than he expected. The story began long before that, in the spring of 1967, when Aretha recorded Respect at Atlantic Studios in New York. The studio was already cramped, filled with the band, horn section, and engineers, all sweating in the heat. But according to producer Jerry Wexler on PBS's Music Makers Revisited, 1979, Aretha sang with such intensity that the air in the room changed, as if every high note she pushed carried a burst of warm breath from her whole body. A veteran technician, Charles Boyd, once said that whenever Aretha belted powerfully, the glass of the control room fogged up from the moisture. These stories sounded exaggerated until Paul experienced something similar, not in a studio, but at a crowded gala. In September 1973, Capitol Records held a major event in Chicago attended by artists Paul knew well. Aretha performed the closing number, and wanting a good view of the stage, Paul stood near the aisle beside the curtain wings. When Aretha finished her song, the stage lights hit her directly, and the shimmering fabric of her dress darkened in distinct patches from perspiration. She stepped down, passing right by Paul on her way backstage, and in that exact moment, he felt a thick, warm wave of air brush gently across his face. It wasn't unpleasant in a negative sense, but extremely strong, the scent of a performer who had given everything, mixed with heat trapped under her stage outfit for hours. Paul said it jolted him awake, and his immediate reaction was to straighten his posture to regulate his breathing. Interestingly, Paul was not the only one to describe such moments. On Soul Stories Live, 1984, a choir member who had performed behind Aretha said that sometimes they had to change positions because the warm moisture rising from her long gown felt like standing next to a steam machine. During a 1968 Detroit show, lighting technician Eddie Marshall even had to wipe the stair rail after Aretha walked down because condensation had settled visibly. Small anecdotes like that occasionally became topics for humorous newspaper snippets. The Chicago Sun-Times once printed a lighthearted piece about the warmth of the Angel of Soul, causing a photographer to switch lenses because condensation blurred his shots. Though playful, the article inadvertently fueled rumors that Aretha carried a halo of heat around her whenever she performed. Paul didn't believe all the exaggerations, but his experience in Chicago was unmistakable. When Aretha passed by, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Her breath was heavy, her shoulders rose and fell with effort, and even the light airflow from her steps carried a dense, vivid scent, as if the entire room had just sung with her. He never felt upset with Aretha. Paul understood that to sing like that, to shake an entire hall, she had to give everything. But it didn't change the fact that her natural scent after such performances was intense enough to make him pause for a moment. Yet even this wasn't the most shocking part of Paul's memories, because the next person wasn't a soul legend or a rock star, but someone far more familiar to Paul, someone he had worked with for years. And that closeness was exactly why he couldn't avoid the scent he once described as the most overwhelming of my entire career. 7. John Lennon. I never liked being in the studio with him for too long. There are stories Paul McCartney never needed to force himself to remember. They simply stuck to his memory, just like the sheen of John Lennon's sweat once clung to the Cavern Club stage for months.
And I couldn't take it in. I just know, just for days, you just couldn't think that he was gone, you know.
Paul joked in a 1988 Liverpool radio interview, "I could tell John was coming even before hearing him. The air would change first." It sounded humorous, but it was remarkably close to the truth during the years the Beatles performed in the tightest venues in England. In the summer of 1961, the Cavern Club on Matthew Street was so packed, there was barely space to move. The ceiling was low, cigarette smoke filled the air, and the stage was only as wide as 2 steps. John at that time was young, fierce, singing as though he wanted to throw his entire breath into the microphone. But that intensity made him sweat constantly. Paul recalled that sometimes, when John stood close to harmonize, he could feel the warm moisture rising from Lennon's shirt onto his own side. A former Cavern employee, Ray McFall, once said on a BBC Merseyside program that after the shows, the cloth used to wipe the microphone always smelled the most like John. He joked, "We could tell how hard John sang just by the cloth." It sounded amusing, but it revealed a reality. John's sweat didn't just have a strong presence, it lingered. In later years, once the Beatles left the Cavern and entered the suffocating work schedule of the 1960s, things got even more intense. During the recording of Revolver in 1966, Abbey Road engineer Jeff Emmerich said that John would sometimes arrive late on summer mornings, rushing into the studio still damp with sweat. Studio 2 was sealed tight for vocal precision, so if John walked across the room, his natural scent spread like a thin mist, prompting staff to turn on additional fans. Paul remembered one particular afternoon in June 1966. John had just finished recording vocals for She Said, She Said. He removed his headphones and walked past Paul toward the hallway. In those few seconds, the air shifted to a slightly sour, dense, vivid scent. Not horrible, just very real, Paul told journalist David Frost in a 1984 conversation. He had to crack open the studio door to get a breath of fresh air. But what made the story especially dramatic was that Paul couldn't escape John even if he wanted to. They stood beside each other on stage, sat next to each other in the studio, and shared the same microphone in hundreds of performances. The harder John sang, the more intense the scent. The louder John laughed, the more warmth drifted into the air. During gigs in Hamburg, musician Tony Sheridan said on Backbeat Diaries that John's sweat would drip onto guitar strings and microphones, making the air around the stage as heavy as steam in a washroom. Numerous smaller tales circulated backstage. A sound manager at the Star Club in Hamburg said they had to replace microphone covers twice as often on nights when the Beatles performed. An old Liverpool Echo snippet once teased that the Beatles brought both youth and the scent of youth to the stage, giving front-row fans the full experience. Though satirical, it unintentionally added to Lennon's growing list of backstage anecdotes. Paul never mentioned these stories to belittle John. They were brothers, partners, two halves of a whole. But he still admitted that John's sweat was one of the most unforgettable and sometimes most difficult things from their early years. John wasn't trying to cause discomfort. He was simply explosive, focused, and often unaware of his physical state while creating or performing. Yet the reality remained. That scent became part of Beatle history, something Paul remembered clearly even without wanting to. And from John's story, Paul's list entered a completely different chapter. No more distant colleagues, no more artists he barely knew. The next person was someone who caused backstage chatter for years, because, as one Manchester recording employee put it, his scent didn't follow any rule at all. 8. George Harrison. He didn't talk much, he didn't move much, but the scent was not small at all. Among the four Beatles, George Harrison was always seen as the calmest. He quietly stood in the corner of the stage, avoiding unnecessary noise. But perhaps because of that calmness, many assumed George never caused any trouble. Paul McCartney thought differently. To Paul, George had a certain silent presence, so distinct that you could sense it before you even saw him. The story didn't begin on a big stage, but in a cramped basement rehearsal room at Abbey Road in early 1965. While the Beatles were practicing You Like Me Too Much, George walked in wearing his favorite black wool turtleneck. Paul, who had his back turned while talking to engineer Norman Smith, immediately sensed a shift in the air behind him as George crossed the doorway. He turned around and saw George tuning his guitar, completely unaware that from the thick collar of his sweater drifted a warm, dense smell, like velvet fabric that had been kept heated for too long. In a 1985 interview at Abbey Road, Paul said that George had a habit of covering himself from neck to chin, regardless of the weather. Whether the sun was out, whether it was cold, whether the practice room was overheated, or the backstage was crowded, George always chose clothing with excellent heat retention. The issue was that those fabrics also retained scents very faithfully. One memory Paul recalled most vividly happened during the drive from Birmingham to Manchester in April 1966. The Beatles were in a closed van, no air conditioning. The window opened only a crack because of the loud wind. George sat right next to Paul, still wearing his thick stage turtleneck after the Birmingham Odeon show. Just 15 minutes after the van started moving, the air inside had already filled with a warm, dense, slightly damp smell. Not overpowering, but thick, like heated wet fabric drying inside a cupboard. Paul and Ringo quietly opened the window a bit more to breathe, while George simply looked out the glass, completely oblivious. Tour staff member Terry Doran, who later worked for Apple Corps, once said he often had to open the van doors for a few minutes before departure to air out George's outfit. In the 1967 internal notes of NEMS Enterprises, a small comment circulated saying that G. Harrison's stage clothes should be aired early because the scent holds very long. No one confirmed its absolute accuracy, but backstage managers repeated the story for years whenever reminiscing about Beatles' touring days. Another anecdote happened in Japan during the June 1966 Nippon Budokan performance. The backstage area inside the Budokan was closed in, with very little ventilation. George entered the dressing room still wearing his high-collar costume. A Japanese security staff member later said on the show, remembering Budokan, that he had to step outside the hallway for a few minutes just to regain his breath. No one blamed George, but those who witnessed it said the air in the dressing room changed the moment he walked in. A short 1967 New Musical Express article once hinted that one Beatle caused backstage chatter for wearing stage outfits too long, though it didn't name who. Those in the touring crew knew exactly who it was. When asked about the article, Paul simply laughed and said, "Of course it was George. He was quiet, but his clothes weren't." What made things awkward for Paul was that he couldn't avoid George like he could with other artists. The two stood next to each other during countless performances, sat side by side in vans, and shared the same overheated rehearsal rooms. George didn't speak much, but the scent from his thick collars and wool fabrics, warmed by performance, always lingered whenever he came near. Paul respected George deeply, but that didn't mean his nose was unaffected. And just when Paul thought George's story was already the peak of quiet but heavy, another artist walked into the list. Someone completely opposite of George. Not quiet, not reserved, not restrained. A man known for a powerful voice so intense that technicians often had to stand several meters away because his body heat spread like a flame. 9. Tom Jones. A masculine scent, but so strong that you simply couldn't overlook it. People always said Tom Jones had a voice like fire, moves like the wind, and an energy no one could match. But behind the scenes of early 1970s music shows, there was another insider saying that fans rarely heard. If Tom just finished performing, you'd better stand a few meters away. The joke stayed alive for years because anyone who had ever stood near Tom after a song understood it wasn't a joke at all. Paul McCartney once recalled that the hardest moment to breathe backstage in his entire life happened in the autumn of 1971, when he and Tom both appeared at a charity performance recorded by Thames Television at the Savoy Theatre, London. Right after Tom finished Delilah, the entire stage erupted. The crowd stood cheering, spotlights swept across the auditorium, and Tom spun, flipped his hair, and strode across the stage with movements powerful enough to make the overhead lights tremble. But it wasn't until Tom stepped off stage that Backstage truly went into shock. The microphone he had just used was passed to the standby host, but no one dared to touch it. A young technician named Marcus Stilwell later said on Behind the Stage UK that the microphone was as wet as if it had been dipped under running water and had to be wiped 3 times before reuse. Paul was standing near the wings waiting for his cue. When Tom returned backstage, Paul stepped forward slightly to greet him and immediately froze. The scent coming from Tom was so strong that the air felt thick for a few seconds. It wasn't just simple sweat, it was an unforgettable mixture. The heat of overworked skin, heavy cologne, hair oil dissolved by perspiration, and the warm, synthetic smell of stage fabric heated by lights. Paul said in an interview with Q magazine, "I adore Tom, but standing right next to him after Delilah, that takes courage." Both amusing and completely true. But the issue wasn't just the scent. Tom performed with his entire body. Every time he moved, moisture rose around him like a faint mist. A backstage worker once joked, "Why doesn't the stage fog rise? Because Tom's heat is heavier." The line appeared in a 1973 behind-the-scenes clip archived by the BBC for their series The Music Floor Archives. More than once, Tom caused the dressing rooms to switch on industrial fans just to clear the warm air. At a Portsmouth Guildhall show, as reported by Martin Lee of the Daily Mirror, 2 dancers had to step back 3 paces to avoid the dense heat wave after his final song. And that was Tom after just one performance. Imagine Tom on a long tour, hours of singing, spinning, flipping his hair, belting out his signature high notes. The scent of sweat mixed with heavy cologne only thickened over time. London television crews jokingly called Tom a walking whirlwind of heat. Some even said, "You don't need to ask if Tom just finished a song, just check the hallway scent." Paul never criticized Tom, but he admitted frankly that once he had to step behind the velvet curtain just to catch a breath again. Not out of disrespect, simply because Tom's natural aura was incredibly strong, especially when amplified by stage heat. But the most surprising thing was, Tom still wasn't the peak of Paul's list. Because right after Tom came another figure, a rebellious icon, a spirit of the rock movement, someone Backstage crews always described with one line. She didn't just bring music, she brought the scent of an explosion. That person was Janis Joplin, the one Paul said, just walking into a room she could change the entire atmosphere. 10. Janis Joplin. Liquor, smoke, and sweat, heavy, sharp, pure rock. In the history of American rock, some artists leave their mark through sound, some through their lifestyle. But Janis Joplin left behind the very air around her. A sound technician from the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival